So guys, I want to talk about this First Step Act, and specifically I kind of want to touch on Donald Trump's endorsement of it and some of the response to it. Before I get into that, I'm going to give you just a brief explanation of the First Step Act, what it is. I'll talk about it more in depth later in the video, but let me just give you an overview. The First Step Act is essentially a prison reform act for the federal prison system. Now, one thing to note here is that the federal prison system is a tiny piece of America's whole over-incarceration issue, right? The vast majority of prisoners are, in fact, in state prison systems, but still, the thing about the federal prison system is that, being that it's a federally controlled entity, reform for these prisoners, changes for these prisoners can only come from the federal government. And this bill introduces a lot of changes to, or the ability to adapt some past sentences that were probably unfair, and which laws have already been passed to stop those same sentencing guidelines in the future. Again, I'll get more in depth into the specifics towards the end of the video. And also to implement some programs and things to decrease recidivism in federal prisoners. I think this is an interesting bill because of both who is supporting and who is opposing this bill. So you understand, this bill was written by a Republican, and as I said a minute ago, it has been endorsed by Donald Trump, the Republican president. But a lot of people who are the most staunch opponents of this are also Republicans, like Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton and certain far-right media outlet. It seems to me that there's not a whole lot of noise coming out of Democrats one way or the other, but from what I can glean, there are some who are strongly supporting this bill, but the general idea seems to be, mild support for this. And I think that mostly comes down to just their fundamental, at their core, opposition of Donald Trump. And I really don't know how, I think maybe they really just don't know how to react to agreeing with him on something, because they're so hardwired to just disagree with everything he says. But it is an interesting paradigm. And, I'm okay with it, because as much as I think that the partisanship in this country has really done nothing to serve us, and I'd like to see, something override that partisanship and really become a fundamental issue of every senator and congressman and politician really thinking for themselves and examining something and going, well, I don't know what my party narrative is here, so I actually have to use my brain and make a decision for myself, and really decide what the best thing for the country and its people is. A lot of the things on the sentencing guidelines side that this stuff corrects, or that this bill corrects, is kind of built in this really bad failed war on drugs that we had, and also a fundamental misunderstanding of drugs and the drug trade. For example, one of the things that has already been corrected, and that this bill aims to further correct, is the disparity in sentencing between possession of crack and powdered cocaine. And it also aims to put in place things that would decrease recidivism once people have completed their sentencing. Legally decided by a judge and jury sentencing, right? Which is how our justice system is supposed to work, right? This is supposed to be America. It's supposed to be a land of opportunity. And I'm living proof that it is a land of second chances, right? And that is a conservative value. That is an American value. The fact that we have a prison system that is broken to the point where when most people get out, the only option that they have is to pick back up where they left off and end up right back in, is something A, that is uniquely American, and B, is something that is not a good thing. That is a bad thing, right? If we were to truly uphold traditional conservative and American values, we would want to see people sentenced fairly for their crimes, and then upon being released, having spent that time being re-educated and retrained so that they can enter society as productive members of society, so that at that point they have the same equality of opportunity as everybody else. And so at that point, it is now their personal responsibility to either take that opportunity and make something of it, or to then make the conscious decision to end up back in the prison system. So let me break down the individual pieces of this bill and what they do, so that you can make your own decisions on whether or not you think this is a good thing. Now, the first thing that I want to address is, because I already mentioned it, the issue about the sentencing disparity between powder and crack cocaine. Now, essentially in 2010, something called the Fair Sentencing Act was passed to reduce that disparity in sentencing, which originates in war on drugs era policies, which specifically target the crack industry, which in the 80s and early 90s was a much newer phenomenon, and it was kind of a thing that was sweeping the country. But this provision in the First Step Act allows people who were sentenced prior to the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010 to have their sentences amended to the new guidelines post Fair Sentencing Act. Estimates state that this would allow about 3,000 prisoners to immediately petition for their release should this bill be passed. To put that into context for you, and before I move on to the next thing, I just want to explain this to you. These are people who, if they were sentenced according to today's guidelines, they already would have been released or be eligible for release. The second thing that this First Step Act would allow is it would allow judges to ease sentences in relation to non-violent drug offenders, right? Now, as it currently stands, for those who don't know, there's this whole point system when sentencing guidelines come into play that has to do with past offenses, current offenses, different things that can add on to the severity of a sentence. Just for some examples that come to the top of my head, crimes committed close to a school or a church or a park gain extra points in sentencing guidelines. Violent crimes obviously gain a lot of extra points. Extra victims of crimes gain extra points, etc. Now, this would allow judges to extend. Currently, they're allowed to, in the case of nonviolent drug offenders with little to no criminal record, they are allowed to sentence them below the sentencing guidelines if they see fit. Now, this new First Step Act would allow them to extend that same leniency to only nonviolent drug offenders, that's it, but also ones who had a more significant criminal background than the ones who are currently eligible, right? Again, this is something that makes sense to me. If you have somebody who has a quote-unquote criminal history, right, but their entire criminal history is nonviolent drug offenses, right, or predominantly non-violent drug offenses, in other words, victimless crimes, that, to me, seems like the perfect example of somebody who, given the right re-education and the right opportunity, may still be able to be turned around, right? May still be able to become a productive member of society. This is not somebody who is out there shooting people or beating people with a baseball bat. This is somebody who probably is just trying to make a living for themselves, or maybe even who just has an addiction problem. As an addendum or an extension to this, the bill also reduces the sentencing guidelines for repeat, and again, I state, non-violent drug offenders only. And one of the key things that it cuts out is a current provision which allows somebody with 3 or more non-violent drug offenses to be given life without parole. As it stands right now, if you're caught with a serious quantity of drugs or conspiring to distribute a large quantity of drugs 3 or more times, even if you've never committed a violent crime, even if, you've never been caught stealing anything or harming anybody directly, as it stands right now, you can be, under the sentencing guidelines, given life without parole. In my opinion, obviously that's the worst thing you can be sentenced to short of the death penalty. I think some people would argue it's worse. At least with the death penalty, maybe we can get this over with a little bit quicker. So we are essentially right now with our guidelines stating that selling drugs is as bad as or worse than a child. Which to me doesn't seem to really add up. Another thing that's under the sentencing guidelines parts of this has to do with the sentencing of or the addition of gun charges onto non-violent drug offenses. Now, to me, I'm gonna put a link or in a comment, and I'll also have Maria put the webpage right here where you can view the whole bill, because I'm not gonna lie to you, I'm kind of like, I don't really get part of this. The problem is I don't know what the law is as it stands right now. But what I can glean from this is that as it stands right now, if somebody is like a first-time drug offender, and they are in possession of a gun, even if they did not use the gun in the commission of a crime or anything, they can add up to 25 years onto their sentence by adding a gun charge onto there, and this would stop them from doing that. That's the best way I can interpret this, but again, I would need to do a lot more research to understand how this law is implemented now, and to completely understand what the First Step Act is doing by removing this law, because I'm kind of not clear, and I would rather just not say anything than say something that turns out to be inaccurate. Now, the other thing, and the last thing I want to touch on that this bill does, and I mentioned earlier, is decrease recidivism rates. It has programs in it that are designed to decrease the likelihood that somebody will end up right back in prison after being released. So this kind of has two facets to it that I can see. Firstly, it incentivizes prisoners to take part in training and education programs while they are in federal custody by giving them extra good time, essentially, is how I'm reading this. But only giving them that good time if they take part in the training and education programs being offered. Now, this also would provide additional funding to the federal prison system to strengthen and enlarge these training and education programs. Now, this is super important because, again, it speaks to that equality of opportunity thing that I mentioned earlier. For a lot of people, I think the majority of people coming out of long prison sentences probably have been in there since they were pretty young, right? A lot of people, they were sentenced at 18, 19, 20, 21 years old, right? Or at the very least, they are missing years of work history and stuff. And being that they were involved in a criminal enterprise prior to being incarcerated, they probably don't have a good marketable skill to make a legal, honest income. These training programs, which can range from like carpentry to small engine mechanics, botany, metalworking, all sorts of things, right? Machine shops. this gives these people an incentive and an opportunity to train in these careers while they're incarcerated. So when they get out and they go and look for employment, all of a sudden, it gives employers an additional reason to want to give them an opportunity. So anyway, there it is, guys. First Step Act, written by a Republican, endorsed by the president, and seemingly also most staunchly opposed by other Republicans. This bill also does have some Democratic support to make up for that kind of schism in the Republican Party. And I think it'll be a good exercise, actually, if the U.S. government can kind of put aside the partisanship for a minute and actually really work on something. There's so much in this bill, and there's so many things even that I didn't even touch on. And there are certainly things you could nitpick and complain about this little aspect or that little aspect. But I think that the overwhelming majority of it is very much positive things that will benefit the country as a whole. And a lot of it, too, is just going back and enforcing things that have already been made law, or shifting things that have already been made law and making them retroactive. I think that the president was right to endorse this bill, and I really do hope that we see it get passed. But only time can tell. Don't forget, please, to like and subscribe. Really helps me out a lot, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.